Well, hello and welcome to everybody who's joining us online for the second initiative of the week. Last night we had a business initiative. Tomorrow night we have a marriage one coming up. And tonight we are dealing with loss. And I'm really hoping that for those of you that have been through a difficult time and experienced loss now during lockdown, or maybe even prior to lockdown, that what we're going to be sharing tonight is going to help you process, maybe just identify where you are at, and even maybe find some help and be able to meet with somebody to talk a little bit more. So I've got two guests with me tonight, Mads Daisel. Daisel, is that how you pronounce it? Yeah, some people said Diesel when I've listened to it before. So Mads Daisel and Bronwyn Sherry, and it's so good to have the two of you with us. Bronwyn's going to be sharing a little bit of a testimony a little bit later, and then most of our time tonight is going to be with Mads as she just answers some questions around this area of loss and grief. But maybe let me just start with Bron, and maybe Bron, just tell us who you are, what you do.
Cool.
Yeah.
So it's really exciting to be here. If we haven't met, my name's Bronwyn, or Bron, and I've just opened my own counselling practice called Flourish Counselling, which launched during the lockdown, so it's been interesting times. I have my honours in psychology and a master's in social development, and really just a heart for people. I'm married to Ryan, and I'm a lover of Jesus, the sea, and tea.
Good. I'm a lover of the sea too.
Yeah.
And believe it or not, so is Mads. Mads, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, so my name's Mads. I am a Durban surfer chick who is now relocated to Joburg. I'm a mom of two boys, Joshua and Levi, and married to Dennis. And I run a ministry called Edify, which partners with churches to empower them with counseling resources so that we can better address mental health and emotional well-being in our local communities. So yeah, that's who I am.
Yeah, Mads is very modest and very humble, but I really think she is a great asset to the body of Christ, and a great gift to the body of Christ. She's has a theological training and psychology training as well, but she really wants to just see people free in Jesus and whole in Jesus. And so she has made it her life mission to serve Jesus by raising up lay counselors in local churches to be able to do that. And she used to be down at a church called Grace Christian Family Church down in Natal. She started a counseling center there, was there for 13 years. By the time she left, I don't know how many hundreds of people she had trained, but there were 150 people or slightly over that on the ground involved in counseling every single week, and they were seeing 50 to 60 people. And Mads' heart really behind it is some people, in fact the majority of people, are unable to afford counseling, and so she thought it would be great to see the church reaching into that sphere. And so Mads, we're incredibly grateful to have you tonight. Bron, I'm grateful that you're starting this journey, and a crazy time to start in lockdown. But I know you've been through some loss yourself, and it's pretty recent. And one of the amazing things about Bron is when I asked her, we'd love you to share, but if it's still a little bit too raw, you don't have to, give it some thought. She came back immediately and she said, I don't have to give it thought. I know God wants me to encourage other people with the comfort I've received. So maybe just tell us a little bit of your story.
Sure. Yeah, it really has been an amazing journey, and really one where God has revealed so beautifully the purposes that he has in the pain and in the struggle. I think if you'd asked me 18 months ago what loss is and what it feels like to go through loss, I wouldn't really have been able to tell you. I've never really lost anyone close to me. I'd never really experienced loss of any kind. And then this last year has just been a series of kind of highs and lows, and God really taking me through some stuff. Last year, in June, my husband and I lost our first baby to miscarriage, and that was really the first like deeply personal loss that I had ever felt, and it really rocked me. And it was a time where I really had to kind of turn to God and surrender and just kind of say, Lord, how do I get through this? You know, if you had asked me before that had happened, could I ever imagine surviving that? I would not have thought I could. But God has really shown me that in my weakness, he's made strong. And that's really what I saw kind of starting at the beginning of this. And then, so that was in June. And then in August, we lost my Nana, who, after a long struggle with cancer, and her and I were very close. And that was a different kind of loss. That was sort of not as unexpected, but still loss and still mourning. And we were still kind of mourning the loss of the baby, and then it was her. But it looked different. And then this year in the beginning of March, we had a second miscarriage. And so we've got two babies in heaven who I can't wait to meet one day. And I think that's the beauty of, I mean, I don't want to say the beauty of death, but, you know, when we're believers and when we know that we're made for eternity, we know that we have something to look forward to. And so I have this illustration in my house of Jesus holding my two babies. And I look forward to the day when I can see them again. But I think what I've learned is that each loss is so different. Each loss affected me differently. Each loss I processed differently. This second miscarriage rocked me to my core. I would be lying to you if I sat here and said, you know, that I was able to kind of praise God through it all. In those first few days, they were really dark. And, you know, I had to ask myself, you know, I know all these things about God. I know that he's good. I know he has perfect plans. But do I trust that when I feel like he's taken all of this and I'm kind of at the lowest of my lows? How will I ever get through this? And I remember there was a moment where I sat and I was like, I don't know if my faith can survive this. And I think what has been so beautiful, and I just remember walking into church, so that all happened on the Wednesday, and it was very sudden and very unexpected. And then on Sunday I was like, do we go to church? Like, how do I feel about this? And I remember walking in and Lorelei was actually there, and she was the first person that I saw, and I just started crying, and I just felt like this is where I needed to be, and I felt like a turning of my heart towards the Lord. And so I think over the last year I've really learned not only how God's heart is so for us and how he's not a distant God and he's so present, but also the importance of reaching out to your community. I felt physically carried on prayer throughout, specifically with the miscarriages, and I firmly believe that we wouldn't have gotten through the way that we did, and our faith wouldn't have been emboldened the way that it did without that sort of community support. And so one of the biggest things is just to reach out, is to be honest with your community. God uses them to come in and to support us and to walk with us, because sometimes he did feel far, you know, and so it was important for me to have those friends, and an important thing both for those of us experiencing loss, but also trying to comfort those who have lost, is that I know that in the depths of it all, it didn't matter what you said. I didn't necessarily feel comforted, but those words came back when I was in a space. And so maybe on the day someone had sent me a Bible verse or whatever, and it might not have really felt like anything, but a day or two later, sort of the clouds cleared a little bit and I was able to really take that in. And so, yeah, I think it's just to kind of stick with it. And I just needed people to show up. I just needed community to say, hey, I'm thinking of you. Hey, I'm praying for you. The first miscarriage, I was able to really communicate with friends what it felt like and what I felt I needed, not knowing I would go through it again. So the second time it happened, people knew, like, how do we be there for Bron? How do we, you know, support her? And that really helped a lot. And so I think it's important to be honest with our community, but also with God. You know, I learned that it's okay for me to go to him and be like, Lord, I'm so broken and my heart is so sore and I don't understand this and I don't get it. And there were days when I was angry and I was like, why? It's not fair. You know, I felt like a 2-year-old, and sometimes I still do, you know. I you know, want to lie on the floor and kick my feet and be like, it's not fair, Dad, you know. But he is my dad, and he's shown me that he cares about the desires of my heart and he cares about the pain that I'm going through, but his purposes are perfect in that. And so I can't really explain how it's all come to be other than the fact that God has just met me where I am, and I haven't needed to fake it. I haven't needed to pretend that I'm okay. In fact, I've needed to be really honest with myself, with my God, and with the people around me. And so that's been really beautiful. And I think something that I also learned about loss, which I think we take for granted, is whether it's losing a person, losing a job, losing income, it's not just the event of loss. So it's not just losing the person or losing the job, but it's the hopes and the dreams and the plans around that. And so, like, loss isn't always just a person. You know, like when we lost our babies, it wasn't just the baby, but it was the hopes and dreams for that child. It was in my head, I knew due dates. I knew, they're going to be this old, and what school are they going to go? It sounds silly, but that's, as women, I think, the minute you find out you're pregnant, it's just like their whole life is planned. And it's the same with a job, it's the same with even, people who feel as though they've never sort of met their spouse or their husband, and they've had to kind of mourn the fact that they might never get married, or, that's a season. Like, there's just so much so much loss that we experience. Yeah. And it all looks different. It's ups and downs, and the biggest thing I've learned is just that grief is messy. It's ups and it's downs, and it's not knowing, and it's feeling you're fine one day, and the next day just it all comes crumbling down. But it's that constant, although I feel like the encouragement is to turn away from, well, not the encouragement, the temptation is to turn away from God and to kind of want to be mad and want to be like, I don't understand, and how can you be good? When we allow ourselves to be drawn in by him, and when we just turn to him, even in our anguish, even in our pain, and we just lay down and we just cry, like, I don't have to have the words, he just meets us right there. And so that has just been such an encouragement and just so beautiful. It's just learning to really rely on him. Yeah.
Sure, Bron. Well, I can't put myself in your shoes. I hear what you're saying, but I don't know the emotions that you would have felt. But there are so many valuable lessons from what you've shared there, that there are people that you can talk to. So speak to that community. Things like grief is messy. Yeah. So there are days when you feel on top okay, and other days you feel like you just want to lie on the ground and throw a tantrum. But the important thing is to be honest with God, to speak to people that you can trust, and then he begins to help you through that process. Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing that story. I know it comes from a deep heart of going through a difficult season, but thank you just for encouraging some people, and that's what I would really want to say to those of you that are watching. Be encouraged to know that maybe what you're feeling isn't just you feeling that. When you feel like your grief is really messy, know that that is often the picture of grief, but also see that there is hope in the midst. There are people, a community maybe around you that you can speak to, that can help you through that, and of course, very importantly, a church community. So thanks so much for that. Well, we're going to ask some questions to Mads now, but before we do, maybe I can just pray for us, that God would really just meet everybody that's online right now where they're at. Father, Bronwyn said that she didn't know whether her faith would survive. And Lord, maybe there's some people watching tonight and they don't know whether their faith would survive. Maybe they're not even in that place where they would say they have any faith at all. But Lord, you see them and you see their loss. And Lord, you're just wanting to give them some help tonight. You're wanting to help them to take some steps forward. And then beyond tonight, Lord, you're wanting to continue to help them. So Lord, I just pray that the questions that we ask and the answers that we give would just help some of the people that are watching right now. And we ask for that in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, Mads, I think Bron really touched on it a little bit there, in her story. She spoke about loss being more than just the physical loss of the baby, to being also a loss of dreams, the plans that you had for that little one. So maybe you can just tell us, what kind of losses you've seen people experience during this season of COVID.
Yeah. Sure, I think Bronwyn gave us such a great foundation to work off of, but so often we associate loss generally with death, but I think, as Bronwyn so rightly said, even when we have lost those that we loved, it's those dreams, the hopes, those anniversaries, those expectations of the future that we still have to process. Yeah. But from a COVID perspective, there have been so many levels of loss from the initial early days of just physical connection, for those who were introverts versus those who were extroverts, they processed that differently. Just loss of the familiar, of how we did laugh, from those who had invested so much in their businesses, whether it's, from their own private business or just just investing in projects, all of that time and foundations laid and hard work, income for so many. There was a loss of employment, loss of what worked, of what we knew. And then one of the biggest that I saw was that loss of power, loss of control, loss of freedom, loss of just the ability to decide when I wanted to go and exercise, and what I wanted to wear, and do I want to wear a mask or not? All of these little things, I think, have contributed to the many emotions that people are struggling with, albeit unconsciously. And so there are so many levels of loss that people are actually trying to process. And I think why people generally find it hard to process is because sometimes they haven't actually named their loss.
Yes.
And they're feeling the frustrations, but they haven't actually named what is it that I have lost that is triggering these emotions in me. So those are a couple of them.
I mean, I think I've noticed some people too who have experienced maybe a loss of a loved one long before COVID, but obviously going into this isolating time, it's almost brought back memories of that loss, and maybe there are even some aspects of that loss that they never processed initially, that they've only really processed now during lockdown.
That's right.
Because they've been alone and had headspace to think and that kind of thing. I mean, losses. There's different kinds of losses, as you said, but do we process those losses in the same way?
So the answer is yes and no. And like Bronwyn said, even in her journey, how she processed the first miscarriage was very different to the second one. And so in a sense, the emotions that we can go through are generally the same. But the order and the intensity and how we choose to manage those emotions from a behavioral perspective is where it's different.
Yes.
And often you can have one family that have lost somebody or a bunch of people who've all lost employment, and what we tend to do is we compare how one person processes loss with how we process, and that's the worst thing you can do. And I think to just be aware that there is no this is how you enter into the stages of grief and loss versus this is how you exit. There's no kind of start, middle, and finish to it. And even as Bron said, there were days where she was feeling fine, and then she went back to just feeling angry and wanting to lie on the floor, and then feeling fine, and then a couple of months later back to. And so that's the thing with grief, is that it's kind of like a roller coaster. You actually don't know which way you're going to turn. And how, one person may be feeling anger, but the anger is mild. They're just frustrated and agitated. Another person's angry where they're almost just wanting to throw their toys at the cot. So there's varying intensities of emotions. And then how we choose to manage that. Some people may choose to behaviorally escape through a numbing practice, whether it's a substance that they're abusing, or they will destructively want to scapegoat somebody else with their frustrating or angry emotions, and both of those can be quite destructive. So again, different people process and journey differently, and I think the key is to just be true to self. To not compare, and to just go, how am I doing right now? What am I actually doing? And is it working? Is it constructive? Is it destructive? And we can unpack some of that a bit later. But yes or no. It's different.
I suppose what you said there also is a help for people that are watching somebody going through a difficult time or know somebody who's had a loss. Maybe they personally have experienced a loss themselves, but they can't impose how they've processed their loss necessarily on another person.
Completely. And a lot of people do that. They're kind of like, well, you should be crying, or you should be doing this. Sometimes people go into immediate survival mode where they go very task orientated, and people are like, why aren't you grieving? And it's like, well, because they're in a state of shock, or they're in a state of just having to survive to get through a season. And sometimes it's only months or even years later that the grief stage only begins to start.
And I suppose we don't want to rush a person into that necessarily, nor do we want them to delay indefinitely. But I think that's something that's really important for those of you that might be online right now and you're haven't experienced loss yourself, but you're wanting to help somebody with loss. I think that can really help them.
Yeah.
You spoke about the different stages of loss and what that might look like. Talk us through a little bit of what those stages might be.
Okay.
And maybe also just touch on, do you experience every single one of those stages? Do you jump some of them? Maybe initially you experience it or don't experience it, and then years later you experience it.
Yeah.
I mean,
So I'm going to go through them, from beginning, middle to end, but definitely, you may experience loss the first time and start with the first stage, which is shock and denial. And even with COVID, there was a massive shock and denial, even to the point of there's no ways they're going to put the whole world into lockdown. Just think back to those early stages. There's no ways that this actually can't be happening. And so again, it's all of those. For somebody who's experienced grief before, there's a sense of, that's what to think, what to feel, how to behave, what to do. They're almost quite deer in headlights. And for a lot of people, even with COVID and right in the beginning, there was the sense of, so what do we do? Like, what are we meant to think or feel? There was no reference for this. For some, they move into the next stage, which is pain and guilt. And again, depending on some of the circumstances that you're in that are quite unique. Maybe you were an employer who immediately had to retrench people. And so there's the guilt of that. There's the pain of that. There's the pain of being on the receiving end of that. And then there's the betrayal and the lack of loyalty and all of those emotional tensions that people, so if you're, maybe you were somebody that ended up contracting COVID, who passed it on to somebody who ended up passing away. And so there's carrying that kind of pain and guilt. And so if, again, different people experience different things and have to contribute or feel different type of emotions depending on their circumstances of what they're going through. Then often people go into the stage of anger and bargaining, where there's this feeling powerless, this feeling frustrated because we actually have no control of our circumstances. And that can trigger and fuel this feeling of anger. And, it's unfair. It's unfair that I've put all this work in and now it's taken away. It's unfair that I can't go and see my loved ones in hospital. It's unfair that there are these regulations and rules that prevent me from being able to even attend a funeral with my loved ones. And so I'm angry. To that of bargaining, where we almost start to plead with God, maybe, right, if I pray 4 hours a day, will you, do this for me? And so people find themselves trying to gain control through the sense of bargaining. What can I do to try and kind of get some sense of power back? And then when people find themselves in a perpetual state of hopelessness, depression and loneliness can start to kick in. There's the sense of, I can't do anything to change my circumstances, and this feeling overwhelmed. And I'm sure Bronwyn went through that similar thing of, in the sense of, I can't stop a miscarriage happening. I even remember in my years of singleness, I can't just make somebody, that feeling of powerlessness and hopelessness can lead to that place of depression, and it ends up fueling isolation and loneliness, because people often withdraw, not only physically but often emotionally. And people, you can be in a room full of people, or you can be in a Zoom full of people. But if you're not opening up what's going on in your emotions, you will still be struggling with emotional isolation. And so loneliness has got nothing to do whether you have a connection or not. It's got to do with whether you're allowing somebody into your world or not. And so a lot of people put on the fine face. I'm fine. Because they actually don't want to be a burden to others. And so they're struggling with loneliness. And so I always encourage people, if you suspect that somebody's stuck in that loneliness phase of grief, you kind of think, 2-3 months have passed, they should be fine by now. And they say, I'm fine. Ask again, because often it's not the case. And then people move into a place finally of acceptance and hope, where there is this, where almost new perspectives start to kind of kick in, where we start to slowly create new ideas. I remember when, I was fully booked with live training the beginning of the year, and then, 2 weeks after lockdown, everything cancelled, and I was like, what do I do now? And, and as you journey through the processes of loss, suddenly, once the emotions start to dissipate, the creative thinking brain kicks back in, where you start to cognitively and creatively think about new ideas. You start to process differently, but you'll have to allow yourself to go through the emotions in order for them to dissipate, so that the thinking brain can kick back in, and all of these creative thoughts and new possibilities and new life and excitement starts to emerge. I was actually listening right at the beginning of lockdown to someone speak around the stages of grief in the initial days, and one of the kind of added stages that this person, I can't remember who it was, actually added to the stages of grief is meaning and managing tensions, and the sense of allowing our minds to consider meaning in times of loss, in times of difficulty, to almost allow ourselves to see a bigger picture to just the loss I'm experiencing. And for those of you who are Christ followers, this is where we really push into our faith, and in terms of understanding the eternal perspective, which I'll speak a bit later. So that's just in a nutshell the overview. And again, as I said, there's no beginning, middle, and end perfect process to this. There's your journey, and that's that.
But it sounds like one aspect that's really important is obviously not isolating, but you can be present in a room and not be isolated, but you're not emotionally opening up to anybody. So it's really vital to be opening up on that level.
For sure.
Are there some destructive things that we can put in place in this process, things that can actually really not be good for our processing and moving forward?
For sure. Any behavior that results in me avoiding or denying or suppressing or distracting or just numbing what I'm feeling will be destructive long term. We often kind of process a lot of our behaviors from a short term lens, and we kind of fob it off. We're like, it's fine, eating a donut once is fun. But long term it can be destructive, and it's the same with any kind of behavior. And so if I'm not allowing myself to actually get emotion out, because emotion, especially negative emotion, is toxic. It's an actual chemical that can cause destruction to your body on a physiological level. And so we were not designed to live in a permanent state of stress. And so it's so crucial to allow ourselves to actually feel, to get the emotion out. So if I'm just swallowing it, I'm shutting down, I'm avoiding those tough conversations, if I'm turning to behavior that actually allows me to numb. The interesting thing about behavior is that so often what I escape to as a place of avoidance or numbing, I often become enslaved by.
Sure.
And what I mean by that is that if I turn to a substance as a way of numbing what I feel, it might be fine the first couple of times. It might be fine for the first couple of months. But if I continue that cycle long term, I'm eventually going to become addicted to that behavior. And so I become enslaved. And so often from a counseling perspective, people find themselves in secondary cycles that are destructive long term. And they're not only having to now deal with their addiction, but as well, they have to still deal with the grief that they never processed, maybe even 10 years ago. And so this is where a lot of people find themselves long-term really not coping. And so it's so important to just consider, is what I'm doing going to hinder my growth and my potential short-term and long-term? Another destructive cycle that people tend to want to turn to is that of what I call scapegoating, where we look for something to vent our emotions onto. When I don't know how to process them in a healthy way, we kind of spew them out onto others, and then we destructively harm others. And even from a social media perspective, I think a lot of people have seen this, where suddenly somebody makes a comment about how they feel, and they're lambasted with a whole barrage of attacks from everybody else. And there's so much intense emotions on those attacks that I'm going, this is not just about what they've said. There is a lot of frustration that is coming through that attack that belongs to something else.
Yeah.
But they're scapegoating. And so there's no honoring that ends up happening. So those are some of the destructive cycles that we see happening from a destructive approach to loss. Yeah.
I think one of the ones that I've also seen sometimes is a person doesn't take it out on a loved one, but maybe a job that they've always loved.
Yeah.
All of a sudden, this job is just completely terrible,
Yeah.
and it becomes a destructive place for them when it was actually something that
They've had passion
that
for.
they so loved. I know you spoke there about turning to, like substance abuse or something like that, but are there some things that people turn to that actually look like a good thing? So, when you think substance abuse, you sometimes think it's going to numb, but it's probably not a good outlet.
Yeah.
But are there some good things that people turn to that can become equally destructive, but they
Completely.
look nicer? Give us some
Yeah.
examples.
Netflix series.
Yeah.
Just think about how many hours social media is such an addictive space. People are robbed by hours. I don't know how many of you get your regular screen time reports.
Yeah.
And you just think, oh, it's 4 hours a week. No, actually, it's 4 hours a day.
Yeah.
And just the destructiveness of that, in the sense of I'm not connecting with family. I'm disappearing into a screen.
Yeah.
Whether it's shopping, food, like I said, social media, TV, books. These can be positive things. Even exercise. People can become obsessed in spaces where they go, oh well, it's healthy.
Yeah.
But if it's robbing you in healthy spaces, so relationally, with God, with your workspace, people may not be wanting to invest in their work as much because they're just on social media. Long term, again, these are going to have an implication.
Yeah.
And so, definitely, anything that becomes consuming of your time can end up being addictive. And like you say, we think only when it's destructive to us physically that it's wrong.
Yeah.
But people can get psychologically and emotionally addicted to things, and that's equally as destructive. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Are there some warning signs that we need to look out for? We've been through this loss. Maybe it wasn't an obvious loss, like loss of a loved one. Maybe it was a dream that was lost, but we're not processing it as a loss. And is there a way that when we look at that, I can see that there's a warning sign? Actually, it's a loss that I'm processing.
Yeah.
Versus it's just I'm angry at the situation.
Yeah. One of the easiest kind of lenses that I use for that is that, if I'm just angry with the situation, my anger would generally match the trigger. And so you're like, oh well, that's a natural response that there's not kind of disproportionate to the trigger.
Yeah.
But often what people do is they give 1,000 rand response to a 10 rand trigger, where the person on the receiving end of it is like, whoa, like you've just exploded. It's because I forgot to stir your coffee or whatever it is, and it just feels disproportionate. And so often people, especially if they've unprocessed grief or trauma or loss that's happened prior to the current trauma or loss.
Yeah.
And so there's almost an accumulation of grief.
Okay.
That kind of compounds. And so, so if you get these kind of disproportionate responses emotionally to what's kind of triggering them, that's a really big warning sign. Also, people tend to initially kind of lose passion for the things that they naturally love. I remember a season in my life where I went through a loss where I didn't want to surf. It was something that
almost
energized me, but it's like I just had no desire for it. So the things that you normally love to do, suddenly there's almost like, I just don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
Now that can be normal, but when that becomes prolonged, where it doesn't, where those things that you naturally love don't come back into your vision, where just getting out of bed becomes harder, doing the normal routines of life become a burden. And so generally the rule of thumb we say is that when somebody's struggling in a specific area of life, that tension will only happen in that area of their life. They are generally able to function in all the other areas fairly well.
Okay.
But when a person starts red flagging from a mental health perspective or from a depression perspective, it's going to start red flagging in every area of their lives. Their ability to function of work is going to deteriorate. Their relationships are going to deteriorate. Their normal routines in the home environment is going to deteriorate. Their ability to just get up and eat is going to deteriorate. So those are the big warning signs where you can just see that for a consistent period of time, and I'm not just talking about a weekend, I'm talking about 2-3 weeks.
Yeah.
Those are some of the big red flags that you need to look out for, that a person may be slipping into a deeper depression.
Yeah.
That potentially needs to be seeing a professional with. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is there one specific area of loss that you've kind of encountered now during COVID that has been exacerbated? One that you can maybe speak into, maybe one or two?
I think this feeling of lack of control, that loss over the things that I control in life is definitely a massive one for everybody, that feeling of powerlessness. And one of the things that I see people do in those spaces is that they become fixated on the thing that they have no control over. Yeah. And then they're angry about that. And they can't see anything else because that's all their attention is focused on. And so I've almost tried to encourage people that we need to ask ourselves two questions. What do I have control over? Yeah. And what don't I have control over? And to become very clear about the two, and to encourage ourselves to try and shift our attention off of what I don't have control onto new things that I do have control. So when people were frustrated that they couldn't go exercise, and again, that was some people were locked in their homes, but they had gardens. Some people were in flats. Yeah. And so it's like, well, instead of just being angry about what I can't control and the loss of the power over that, go, well, what can I do? Well, this is what I can. I have a friend who lives in a tiny flat, literally 1 bedroom, with a kitchen and everything. She ran a 10K marathon in her flat. She created an obstacle. I don't know how she did it.
She must have got really busy running around.
But I was like, that is awesome. Because she shifted her focus on what she can do instead of just being fixated on what they can't. Yeah. And just doing that simple thing opens up a whole new world of creativity and energy that becomes life-giving. And I think that is one of the biggest areas that I've wanted to just encourage people, to give them a sense of being, of feeling hopeful again, Yeah.
Great. Before I go into the next question, there might be some of you that have some questions, or you're thinking of some questions. Pop it through on the comment section, and we can answer it towards the end of the session. So that loss of power, I think it's a big thing for all of us. All of a sudden we realize life isn't so much in our control as what we thought, but there are some aspects that we can still do something about it in the midst of it. Are there some helpful practices that you can implement, or that people can implement to help them through their season of loss?
I think Bron covered them all, but I think one of the most important things is to know, number one, is that you're not alone. And that there are people that want to help. One of the stats that I've learned over this time period is, and the stat did come from the States, where they obviously have the resources to do these kind of researches, but they say that the average time span between first symptom of struggle, whatever it is, and treatment is on average 11 years. Which just goes to show that people generally struggle and suffer in silence. Yeah. And they kind of just put on their big, their fine faces, they just swallow what they're struggling with, and they kind of keep it inside. Now, these stats are actually pre-COVID. Yeah. And we know already that there is what they're calling a tsunami of mental health crises coming our way because of lockdown and everything that's going on. But I think one of the most important things is to, even in the early stages of struggle, is to intentionally find safe people that you can talk to. I mean, nobody finds a lump and then waits until it becomes stage 4 before they ask for help.
Yeah.
There's the sense of, oh, I immediately need to kind of go and get treatment.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things that from a grief and a loss and even a mental health perspective is that people don't realize that there's actually a whole range of help that we can lean into, from just self-care resources like journaling, exercising. I know a lot of professional psychologists that won't treat you unless you commit to doing at least 20 minutes of exercise 4 times a week, because they know the power of it.
Yeah.
Just sitting in the sun, vitamin D is so good for the soul. So these are all just some basic self-care resources that we can lean into. Then there's, like Bron said, just talking to a friend. Community care, finding a safe space when someone says, how you doing? Instead of saying I'm fine, just say, actually, I'm not fine. Or intentionally phoning someone else and saying, hey, I need a safe space to just offload. I am not coping. We know from a medical perspective, the minute you express emotion, the negative chemical attached to that emotion automatically evaporates. It doesn't stay in your body. It becomes released. It kind of disappears. I mean, the way God has designed our body is phenomenal. But offloading with a friend, there are many churches that have pastoral counseling resources. People generally don't go to counseling because they often can't afford it. I know in South Africa, less than 10% of our population can actually afford to see a professional. But there are many churches that have resources that the people right now are ready and waiting to have a pastoral counseling session with you. It's a matter of phoning and they'll be there. And then lastly, to actually see a professional. So finding a safe space to just talk. Get it out. That is the most powerful thing you can do. Sometimes I say to people, allow yourself daily to bawl in the bath. Is what I call it. Even if you say, right, every day at this time, I'm going to allow myself while sitting in a bath to just sob, to get the emotion out, kind of put it on your ugly face and really get it out. I remember when I went through a stage of loss, I was like, if I'm going to cry, I'm going to do the best cry I ever possibly could and really just allow myself to feel it until there was nothing left. And then the release that comes from that is so life-giving. And I think these are just some of the practical things that people can do to help them get it out. Because that's what's going to help them reactivate that creative brain, which is going to help them see things new and move them to that stage of acceptance and kind of renewal.
I think one of the things you said there is so important, is just to give yourself the space to feel, and like you say, have that real sob in the bath or wherever it might be for you. But I think sometimes we're scared to allow ourselves to feel. We're scared of the emotion. We're scared of where the emotion might take us, and so we don't feel it all. But actually, then we're still feeling an emotion
completely,
and it's a suppressed.
Someone once described an emotional wave like a wave in the ocean, and for those of you who don't know surfing, when a wave comes, especially a big wave, it feels like it's going to drown you sometimes, especially if you're caught kind of in the impact zone, and it'll push you under, and most surfers know that you won't ever be held for generally longer than 20 seconds. So you can hold your breath for 20 seconds and it's going to release you. And emotions come like that. There can be this wave of emotion that comes, and you need to just allow yourself to just go with it, because it's going to release you. And then there's going to be a gap where you're able to catch your breath and kind of, find the surface again. And that's how emotions work. They come in these ebbs and flows, just like waves. And to not be afraid of it. But it's such a beautiful place when you allow yourself to consider the story you're telling yourself, especially in the midst of the most intense emotion. Because that's where we do our most rawest thinking. Where the story I'm telling myself is that God doesn't care, or that, I deserved this, or whatever it is. And so often it's in those spaces where our beliefs start to become entrenched, especially when we don't challenge our thoughts. Is this thought bringing me life or death? What is the source of my thought? Is it going to bring me hope or despair? And so allowing yourself to process even in those spaces of intense emotion can be so life-giving in the sense of just becoming aware of the story I'm telling you, myself.
Yeah, I think you said it earlier on. I think it's so important. A person is going through whatever the loss is, but if you focus just on that and you don't withdraw a little bit and see a little bit of more perspective, it can be a very dire place.
Sure.
Always like to think of that story in the Bible where there's a storm and the disciples are in the boat, and all they can see is a storm. They've forgotten that Jesus is in the boat, and he's just sleeping there. Everything's fine. Obviously, to them, it looked like they were going to die. So I think it's good to recognize, sure, I might die here, but also see a bigger picture that no, Jesus is in the know. Jesus is in the boat. So you mentioned you shouldn't wait too long to go and see someone. When should you go? Is it when you get to a certain one of these stages, or is it better to just start unloading as soon as possible?
I would say start unloading as soon as possible. I just think, as I said, most people just tend to go, I don't want to be a burden. And everybody thinks everybody else is coping. We're always comparing everyone else's Facebook profile pics to their behind the scenes. And so we assume that everybody else is great while we're the only ones not coping. And that's actually not the truth. And so the minute you are just not having a great day, or just not coping, or just feeling frustrated and angry, or any of those kind of stages of grief, call up somebody, even if it's while you're cooking, just say, hey, I just need someone to chat to kind of download what's going through my head right now. As quick, again, it's like saying to someone, if they have cut themselves on a rusty nail, when should I apply disinfectant? Immediately. You wait any longer, it's going to get worse. It's the same when it comes to our emotions.
I was just thinking now, where somebody's lost a loved one, or maybe one or other of the people in the family have lost a job. It often affects the whole family, and sometimes the safe person that you've always spoken to could be your spouse or whatever, but in that moment, you feel like you don't want to bring them into that world because they're feeling the same emotion. What would you say into that? Sometimes if you've lost a loved one and it's your mom and your husband's also mourning, they're having a goodish day, and so you don't want to tell them that you're having a sucky day. What do you do in those situations? Do you still speak to each other so that you both know you're feeling emotion, but then also speak to somebody outside? I don't know.
I think you need to use wisdom in the sense of, if somebody was an RCU, my level of expectation of them would be zero. And so again, somebody might be in emotional RCU in the sense of they're just not able to get out of bed, versus they may be in a day clinic and they're kind of still functioning, but they just can't stand on their leg. And so again, people have varying intensities of struggles, and so you need to just kind of learn to read some of those cues. But I think to be able to say to people that are closest to you, especially a spouse or family members, hey, I can see you're not in a great space. I'm also in that kind of same boat. I'm feeling the same way. Not that I've got an expectation of you. I'm just wanting you to know that I'm side by side with you. Can be a really comforting thing. But I just think it's so crucial that we invest in community. I've always said, my body was not designed for my big toe to support the rest of me. My body is supported by my 10 toes, my feet, my ankles, my legs, my knees, my calves, my hips, the skeleton. There are so many components to my body that I need to lean on in order for it to function holistically. And it's the same with the body of Christ. And the problem is that we tend to want to put often all our eggs in one basket, and then if that basket is too full or suddenly can't contain anything, then we are left stranded. And I think it's it's so crucial that we invest in connecting with small groups, invest in friendship circles that are not just with our peers, but those older than us.
Yeah.
I always say find mothers and fathers out there that are not your biological parents,
Yeah.
Find community, invest in community, be community for others. And the more we do that, the more we are going to have that network of support around us, especially when the ones closest to us that we want to lean on are no longer there. And yeah, so...
Yeah, I mean, I think that aspect of community is just so important. City groups, I've just seen, I told you earlier on, and most people watching would probably know that my mom-in-law passed away, and just watching other people in the church that maybe picked up COVID, and how their city groups gathered around them, and sometimes it doesn't even come past us as pastors. It's just their groups caring and sending meals, and we hear about it, but often all of the hard yards has been done because meal rosters have been sorted out and people are messaging. And I think I found for myself, I've got some men in my life that when I'm going through a tough time and I need to express some emotion, I'll just drop them an SMS and say, I'm feeling like this today out of this loss. Pray for me. And I would really encourage those of you that are online to find some people like Mads has said, and get into a city group, get into a community of people that can love you and care for you, and then be that as well. Because for some of us, we go through a good time and for season, and we're able to help others, and then we go through a more difficult season, and then they can help us, Mads, I've got a question here. And the question is, how do you handle loss of contact with your adult children who have cut any form of communication with you? So that's obviously a big loss. I don't know if you've got any input that you can give into that. Probably too much to just not, you're going to need more info and that type of thing, but just some off the top of your head thoughts.
Look, it's incredibly hard to grieve something when it feels like it's an open door. There's not like a, when there's a loss, there's a finality to it. When there is a relational breakdown or a disconnect, it can be so much more painful because it's there, but it's not there. And so I can't quite connect with it, though my heart yearns for it. And so it kind of leaves you in this open-ended state. And I think one of the most healthiest things you can do is to consider, how am I processing my contribution to the breakdown and the loss of that? Because often, especially parents, we want to consume everything. And then we feel completely hopeless and powerless. I remember actually saying to a parent who had a complete disconnect from an adult child and experienced the pain of that, in the sense of, she would once a month just send out a message and say, hey, I know that I have contributed to hurt. I know I've contributed to a breakdown. And I always I even say to my kids, you own your part. And then to say, when you are ready to have a conversation of restoration, I am here. And there may not be a response to that, and you can't own that part. You have to hand that to the Father and to say, Lord, can you do? And I would imagine even the father of the prodigal son felt elements of that. There was the sense of having to let go from a control perspective, but still keep looking from a prayer perspective. There was that, he stood watching and waiting.
So good. And
his heart was there. And so I would say, whether it's once a month, once a week, to just send out that message of extending a hand of desire for reconciliation. Because that child has to come to their pigsty of saying to themselves, being disconnected is not what I want anymore. And I want to come back. But I need to know that there's something safe to come back to. So if you just own that space of safety, of repentativeness, of willingness to reconcile, that's going to make you feel like at least you are inputting into a space powerfully versus going, it's completely up to them and I have no control over this.
Yeah.
No, there is something you can do.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. No more questions. Maybe just some final thoughts. Just to those that are online right now.
You know, one of the things I'm so aware of is the difference between rigidity and flexibility. I'm going to go back to a surfing analogy. For those of you in Joburg who don't understand surfing, you know, if you take off on a wave and your legs are straight and rigid, you're not going to surf very well. You're going to probably end up falling off and kind of bombing out.
Yeah.
But the whole key to surfing is to be flexible, to be able to kind of adapt according to what the wave is doing. And when you take that principle and concept and you apply it to life, I think those that have taken a rigid stance to life, in the sense of I want to control what I can't control, those are the ones that are struggling the most, versus those that are seeking, how can I be flexible? How can I shift my focus? And so there's three key things that I almost want to kind of leave people with from a flexibility perspective. Is there is a tension that we have to learn to embrace and manage. You know, Romans 8 speaks about the fact that we all look forward to the day where we are liberated from the bondage of death and decay. So the tension we have to manage is that we live in the grip of death and decay. It's our reality. Yeah. For those of you who are over 40, you feel it in your body. Your spirit thinks you can do cartwheels, your body goes no. That's a tension I have to manage. Okay. Ecclesiastes 3:11 says that God has set eternity on our hearts. For me, that is the hope that I hold on to, the fact that I feel like I can still do cartwheels, that I still feel young in my spirit. That is eternity that has been set inside of me, because I was created for eternal living. And so often we look at our birth and our death and this time span, and we kind of look at it as though that is eternity, because it feels long. Especially when we're grieving, when we've lost somebody. It can feel like every day is forever. But we also know that 1,000 years to the Lord is like a day. There's this kind of perspective of eternal living is so much bigger. And so when we embrace this perspective that I was not created just for life here on earth, that I was created for something way bigger, I'm able to better process the tension of death and decay here. And at the same time, to embrace growth. You know, I've written here that we need to glean from grief, because then that's how we grow. Ecclesiastes 7 verse 3 says, sorrow is better than laughter, for sadness has a refining influence on us. You know, you don't grow from the mountaintops, you grow from the valleys, someone once said. It's the hard journeys in life. You heard that from Bron. There's this sense of incredible growth that came from her pain of loss. And so when we glean, when we suck out the marrow from grief and say, Lord, give me every bit of sharpening I can get from this. I just think there is this joy that eventually comes in the morning, and that's the hope we need to hold on to, that we were created for something so much bigger than what we're going through. But it's a tension that we have to manage, not control, manage. It's not going to disappear. It's going to be there. There may be other dread diseases that come in 10 years time, who knows. And so people go, why did COVID happen? Well, we caught in a grip of death and decay. That's why it happened. It's part of the reality of the world we live in. And if I have a healthy expectation of that tension, and at the same time hold on to a bigger kingdom hope that I was created for eternal living, then I'm able to not marry the two, but find hope in the midst of those dark spaces.
Absolutely. Well, Mads, I appreciate you joining us tonight.
Oh, thank you. It's been
thank
awesome.
you for your input into, I'm sure, so many people's lives. For those of you that have joined us online, you may not be the person experiencing loss, but this can be a resource in the hand of somebody who is in that place. And maybe you're just going to be that person that's going to be a listening ear for the next little while. and you're going to help them help see that person through their loss and through their grief. For some of you, maybe you don't really have somebody to talk to. Maybe you do, but you're just needing some prayer or just to express some emotions. I just want to say that pastorally we are available to listen to where you're at, point you into the right direction if you're needing professional help. Most definitely pray for you. So you can contact us at the church office. You can ask for Vaughan, or you can email me at vaughan@cityguardfirst.co.za. But thank you so much for joining us. I hope it's been help for you, and we're praying that Jesus will help you through this very difficult season. Thanks, guys.